In a previous video, I showed you how to generate tile-based structure files with a focus on zeolite frameworks. But that video was primarily concerned with standard zeolite frameworks without any deviations from just a standard tetrahedral network. There are cases where you come across some structures that are slightly more complicated, and this video will show you an example of each of those. So the things that you can come across are disordered frameworks, interrupted frameworks, and frameworks that slightly deviate from the rules of natural tiling. So if we go back to the IZA website, the symbols you want to look out for are these asterisks, which denote partially disordered type materials. That just means that the framework isn't totally regular, there's some disorder in the framework. For example, zeolite beta is a famous one. Or you also want to look out for these dashes, which denote an interrupted framework. That just means that the framework isn't fully connected. There's some missing coordinations between the nodes of the zeolite network. So you can see some coordinations of less than 4, so 2 or 3. This video will show you how to deal with these sorts of frameworks. So let's start with the simplest case, which is the disordered framework, marked with a star. So I've got zeolite beta here in a database. And the disordered frameworks you can pretty much treat the same way as any normal framework. There's just some slight disorder in the structure. It doesn't really change the coordination. It's still a tetrahedral framework. So we can still calculate the adjacency matrix using the same approach, where we use solid angles and a high minimum omega. So if I just run that, it's generated our adjacency matrix. Then we can just calculate the tiling the same way as we normally do, using ADS. Select all our central atoms. You can use the numpad and press plus to select all of them at once, or right click and say select all. Then it'll have calculated our tiling for the structure, and we can view and see our structure file that's been generated. This can now be used with CrystalGrower, the same as a normal zeolite framework. So now let's move on to interrupted frameworks, where we do have to actually adapt our approach slightly. We're looking at this -CLO framework. So if we calculate the adjacency matrix for this framework using the same conditions we used previously, solid angles, minimum omega of 10, we end up having some silicon nodes connected to 5 other silicon nodes. So we know that zeolites are tetrahedral frameworks, so we know this is incorrect. So if we study the adjacency matrix, go to the one that's coordinated to 5. We have 2 bond lengths here that are 8.5 angstroms, compared to the other bonds between silicons, which is about 3 angstroms. So we know that these 2 bonds are probably incorrect. To get around this, we simply just need to increase the minimum omega value. So we'll just change that to, say, 15, for example. Press run. Now those coordinations have reduced down to 3. Now if we just double click to check the adjacency matrix, you can see that those bonds are now missing. So if we right click and say expand all, so we can see these bonds are all roughly the same length, about 3 angstroms. Changing the minimum omega value is actually quite useful for normal zeolite frameworks as well, because 10 can sometimes overestimate the connectivity. Now we can run ADS as we have previously to calculate the tiling and generate the structure file. So I'll click ADS, and I'll need to change some of the options here because the CLO framework actually has a larger ring size than 16. So if I go to the IZA page for the CLO framework, you can see that there are some 20 rings in the structure. So we'll just need to bump that up to 20 and then run to calculate the tiling. Just press yes to all these questions here, and then select all our central atoms, and then wait for the tiling to be calculated. Sometimes more than one type of tiling is calculated for a framework, but the one marked NT will always be the natural tiling. So this is the one that you should use for your structure file. If you right click and press view, then we can look at the structure file that we've generated, then save it to use with CrystalGrower, the same as we have previously. So the step where I looked at the IZA website to find the largest ring size is easy to do for known zeolite frameworks, but for ones that are unknown or hypothetical frameworks, then you'll have to look in your structure and try and identify the rings manually yourself. But the same approach should work, as long as you look for the largest ring size in your structure. So now we can move on to the most complicated case, where you calculate a modified natural tiling for a framework. So why would you want to do this? Let's say, for example, you've calculated your natural tiling for your framework, and you've tried to grow the structure in CrystalGrower, but for some reason your crystal is growing as a very thin plate, like one layer thick. This is due to some situations where you can get very large tiles calculated, and depending on the connectivity of the framework, this can create very large energy barriers towards growth in certain directions. But what do we mean by a modified natural tiling? So if I go back to one of these references that I've discussed previously, it's natural tiling for nets paper, you can see the rules for natural tiling that I've discussed previously. So the rule we're going to look at here is Rule E. So this states that Rule B may be overridden for tiles with wastes of all negative curvature vertices. And Rule B states that the faces of tiles must be locally strong rings. So what that's saying is, when you have wastes of negative curvature weak rings, you can turn that ring into a face, and that's your modified natural tiling. So if I scroll up to this figure here are two examples of where this rule has been invoked. On the right we've got UFI, on the left we've got LTN. So with UFI you can see this tile in the center, which when you separate these two top tiles, you actually get this alpha cage or TGRC that you see in quite a lot of frameworks. So practically this makes sense, as we've shown in our previous research that closed cages are key rate determining steps during the crystal growth of zeolite frameworks. So how do we actually perform this in ToposPro? We need to find some way to override Rule B when using ADS to calculate the natural tiling. The first step, we need to calculate the adjacency matrix as usual, so I'll use AutoCN with the settings we used previously, where we had solid angles and a high minimum omega. Press run and we get our tetrahedral net. So now we need to calculate the tiling with ADS, so I'll select the framework and run ADS. Then look at the options. So I'm going to leave everything the same on this page. But if I go to this page, we've got a ring size of 20 here, which was for our -CLO framework we just looked at. So we can once again look at what the largest ring size in the structure is. As this is a known zeolite, we could go to the IZA and look up UFI, and we can see the largest ring size is 8. Again, if this is an unknown structure, you can look at your CIF file and try and identify the largest ring size in your crystal structure. So if I go back to ADS, I can change that max ring to 8. Now I'll navigate to the tiling tab. You can see that the max tile size has been reset, which always happens when you change your ring size. You can see the rules of natural tiling that are active. So you can see all of them are active right now. But Rule B we want to override because that's what Rule E does. And we remember that Rule B refers to all tile faces being strong rings. So the sensible first step is to try and remove locally strong rings, which we can't disable until we actually disable natural tiles, because we're not actually creating natural tiles here, because we're not following all the rules of natural tiling. So now we can switch off locally strong rings, and you can see Rule B is now inactive. So if you press OK, run, press OK to all the prompts that appear, choose our central atoms, and calculate the tiling. Now we can right click and view our structure file and compare the tiles to the known tiling from the IZA website. So we've got TGRC1, which we remember is part of one of the large tiles which has now been separated, TUFI, T-cube, and also TCLE. So if we go to the IZA, we can see that that's the same as the tiles displayed here. So you can always verify against the IZA if you have a known zeolite code, but if it's an unknown structure, then you won't have this option. You'll have to go based off of the tile names in your structure file. If a tile is not recognized, it will just be titled tile NO, like tile number. But this isn't necessarily wrong, it just means there isn't a corresponding tile in the database in ToposPro. There is an alternative approach for calculating the tiling for frameworks like this, where if we go back to the UFI structure that we started from, and invoke ADS again, Go to Options and go to the Tiling tab. There's this Tiles by Hand option here. So we can enable that. So let's say, for example, we set our ring size as way too high, so 20, when we know that the largest ring size is 8 in the structure. We'll have to just change the max tile size back up to 200 as we change the ring size. So now we've got this Tiles by Hand option selected. Press OK, press Run, and press Enter to all of these prompts. Select our central atoms, and now we're greeted with a new window that we haven't seen before, which is this Select Essential Rings window. This lists all the essential rings in the structure, so you don't actually need to go and look for the largest ring size in your structure if you use this approach. And it only lists up to 8, which we know is the largest ring size from what we've seen before. So if you click Auto here, it'll run through and calculate the tiling as previous. If we right click the structure file and press View, you can see we've got the same result. We've got TGRC, TUFI, T-Cube, and TCLE. The techniques shown in this video should teach you how to manage any framework structure that you come across while breaking down into natural tiles. In the following video, I'll show you how to visualize your tiles using 3DT.